Hello, I'm Susie. This is my podcast. Here I am again with my husky voice. I'm going to be talking about cults some more. In the last part, I talked a little bit about sort of general thinking about cults and a more specific definition of the characteristics that are common to cults and how those characteristics are reflective of some pretty basic psychological need sets, how they grow and how they coerce people in their memberships to support the needs of their leader. So I hope you will hang out and listen with me on this bit. And yeah, on them in a minute. Here comes some more. As I talked about previously, cults do tend to commonly target individuals who are vulnerable. They use a lot of predatory tactics to draw people in and make them feel comfortable and welcome, and then to kind of begin to shape their thinking about the world, about their families, etc. One of the common characteristics of cult is a charismatic leader. And some common characteristics amongst the charismatic leader type is that they are typically narcissistic and powerfully persuasive. And one of the things you'll often hear people remark upon is their eyes, the intensity of their eyes. They drew them in with their eyes. There's a couple photos, right? That if you see David Koresh, you kind of get that feeling. Charles Manson, there's a famous photo of him, where he's just like wide-eyed, like staring at the lens, and these really just sharp, noticeable eyes. Like they just like go right, boink, right to his eyes. The Heaven's Gate guy too, just very like intense, clear, bright, focused eyes. Leaders tend to function as teacher, as parent, government, holy person, but the crucial thing is that they have the answers to everything. They have the answers to everything. They have the secret. They've discovered it or have been given it or was sort of divinely guided to it. Um, I think an important feature to note here, because when you're talking about these things kind of like objectively, very many people react in the same way of like, how, my God, like, how could a reasonable person be persuaded to act in these ways? And it is, I mean, it is not really surprising, but it perfectly reasonable, intelligent people are as vulnerable to as any other person to manipulation because we share common psychological responses, cognitive functions, right? Like we all have certain needs that we want met, whether we're conscious of those needs or not, right? And one of those basic needs is companionship. It's community, it's a feeling of belonging, a feeling of acceptance. And when the world is telling you that you have none of those things because of whatever reason it may be, and there's a person out there who says, we love you, you're a part of our family, that is extremely powerful. And anybody can succumb to it. Anyone can believe that anything is reasonable under the right set of circumstances. I just think that that's really important to call out. I think that we can't solve these kinds of problems as they continue to grow and emerge. And again, I'll talk more about, how they intersect with, our day-to-day society, our governance. They're important to acknowledge that these are not just Looney Tunes, right? Like these aren't just crazy people out there doing crazy shit. That's not productive or constructive, and it doesn't really help. But it is perhaps true to say that they're in a distorted view of reality and that there is a limited pathway to how you guide them back to a clearer picture of reality. Note, I don't say a clear and or perfect view of reality because I don't think that exists. But I think for the most part as a society we function because we can all sort of agree about basic things. Again, it's one of the problems in our politics in America right now is that that fundamental truth is breaking down. But that's a whole nother pod, y'all. Cults use techniques of hypnosis, repetition, chanting. They use processes of stripping away individuality to create a sense of a harmonious community, in some cases, even down to like what they're wearing. Like the Heaven's Gate folks had a uniform, the Moonies also had a uniform. The Scientologists have this really funny, like naval like uniform. It's really funny. They use a common set of techniques to get people's minds into a moldable place. One of the ways you do that is, kind of through a process of gaslighting, right? Like you sort of get them to believe that everything that they have believed or have been taught has been a kind of manipulation in and of itself, that they've been programmed in unhealthy ways, and that this guy, this leader, is going to help them, free themselves from that. Again, it can be very persuasive, and it can be even more convincing when the environment is controlled in such a way that your access to information that would otherwise, dissent from that view, it becomes narrower or more limited. You are then apt to distrust any information that comes to you that doesn't align with your belief system. It seems to you to be a kind of propaganda or a kind of manipulation tool, a tactic, rather than, a assertion of information or a declaration of information. So the vulnerability cycle then kind of doubles down on itself. And who do you look for, reassurance and authenticity? It's the leader. Like it just goes in a cycle. So at that point, it becomes much easier for the stage of extraction of assets, for dissociation with family and friends, for isolation within that community, to be brought into a complete vacuum, and that vacuum then is enforced using a number of coercive tactics. Like you can't go anywhere by yourself, right? Like if you go to visit family, you have to have like a member with you at all times to watching you like 24/7, or not having like phones to be able to communicate with the outside world, or being really like openly discouraged from talking about any kind of publicity that negatively portrays your group, right? So we then are self-policing, right? The community itself is reinforcing the narrative that's being, manipulated in that closed environment, and now everybody's now a fully closed loop, and everybody believes it. It it's a manipulation of worldview, and then that leads to abuse and suppression of dissent, and again enforcement through manipulated tactics or isolating tactics. Sometimes physical abuse is happening, and all of these people who are experiencing that while they're in a moment of believe that they deserve it, that's right, that they fucked up, and this is the punishment that they deserved for daring to doubt. That process can go on for decades for some people. Self-policing is oftentimes delivered through common techniques that we see in everyday society. Punishment of one kind or another, usually involving shunning or shaming, public shaming. We like a good public humiliation, receipts, a open declaration of disapproval of anything that displeases the leader, or that is contrary to a tenet of the leader. And then finally, ruthless pressure tactics to destroy or discredit people who leave the organization. In the case of Scientology, wow. They do it really well, you guys. They do it really well. They should take away Scientology's tax exempt status. Like, they're the biggest bunch of bullshit that I've ever seen. What a horrible organization Scientology is, honestly. It's just so sad. It makes me so, so sad. Well, those different pieces, right, kind of help us understand how someone can stay in an unhealthy situation. We deal with this all the time in our society. I can think of a lot of situations involving women, right? Like any domestic abuse situations, right? The big cliche, right, for people is like, why don't you just leave? There's a lot of psychology at work there that make leaving really, really scary, like almost worse than death. It's a really hard process, and it's not something that a lot of people can just be like, fuck it. I mean, it's terrifying. So I that's a lazy way of evaluating a person's you know need for support, because their whole framework for reality has become distorted. They don't know what's real anymore. The vulnerability that goes along with that is intense. I can kind of understand that. I question my reality literally all the time, but I mean, because I do it all the time, I sort of feel like I'm a little more inured to it. I have a predisposition for it, I guess, as a philosopher. But nevertheless, it's not to say that it doesn't affect me greatly. I mean, I'm doing a podcast, for crying out loud. Who am I? I am a nobody. I'm just a random person in the world, and I am feeling the need to put these thoughts out there because I got nowhere else to put them, and they keep coming. And so clearly I'm having a reaction to the odd psychology, the odd social dynamics, the incredible deconstruction of what I thought reality was into something really kind of like, what? So clearly I'm a part of that process. But happily there's a more or less benign platform for me to put that. And if you don't enjoy hearing me huskily ramble on about social manipulation structures, then you don't have to. You're free to choose not to. And I bless that choice. Honestly, I get it. I get tired of listening to me too, man. So, in any event, in a moment, I'm going to dive into intersections, and let's talk about the intersexuality of cult psychology and cults and everyday social structures. That'll be fun. Okay, so the main reason why I think about cults and why I'm talking about cults is because I think again, it's not fringe. It's a everyday, like, psychological process that's happening, but kind of pulling cults aside as a separate entity, kind of that has a distinct set of easily identified characteristics, helps us to distill out some of those functions. And you see them in an extreme setting, and then they're a little more easily identified in a culture of ambiguity, right? Or in a setting that's less concretely defined in terms of like parameters, right? Society at large. So I'm going to focus on sort of three major areas of intersection: religion, politics, and then social media. And social media, I kind of carve out as its own thing because I just don't know how else to think about it. It is its own, like, sort of cultural phenomena to me, and it shares some characteristics of groupthink like religion and groupthink like politics in and of itself, right? Just in internet culture. It's freaking fascinating. I'm actually definitely going to do an episode just talking about social media at some point, but I really need to think about that because my thoughts are so messy about it. But I digress. Intersectionally, cults and religion. Again, I kind of referenced that in the early part of the initial episode. Again, the funny joke of cult plus time equals religion. It's not necessarily untrue, and certain values that may have been very like fringe or extreme at one point in time become generally accepted. They do attain a level of normalcy. So there's certainly I think some truth to that. And it's just a really cute joke. Way to go, nerds. And I think religions, most of them meet much of the criteria that we've discussed that cults share. But historically, religion plays a more beneficent and legitimate role in creating and supporting communities through a set of shared beliefs, right? Like church communities are benign generally, at best, and well, no, not at their best. They're genuinely supporting and do play an important role in bringing people together and providing, networks of support for its constituent members. Good church communities do good work, and I do not want in any way, shape, or form to denigrate that because, props, man. Like people doing good things regardless of their motivations. I don't care whether it's for Jesus. That's cool. Do it. But at the end, it's a kindness to another person. So I'm never going to not be for that. What I think about Christianity in particular, relative to cults, is that it presents itself as a particularly, open source that cult ideology can attach itself to because of the ambiguity, right? The inherent dichotomy of its core principles, specific yet ambiguous. So again, it's sort of like open source software. You can easily plug into it and come up with a theory that it allies with it, or it has a parallel argumentative style and therefore maintains a kind of coherence that you're like, yeah, okay, I kind of get that. And similarly, there have been moments throughout history where religious community responses, and here I speak more about the religious sensibility more so than an establishment or an organization. So, for example, witch trials were very much a religious motivation because they thought that they were fighting the actual devil. So, they came up with a religious justification for it that was crazy, but to them it made perfect sense. More modern day examples are in the 80s, the late 70s, the early 80s. There was this whole like community reaction to Dungeons and Dragons and heavy metal music, both together and separate, and just a lot of hysteria about devil worship amongst the youths. And again, ridiculous, but you can see how they got there. They're fighting the devil. They believe it. I also would classify much of the in the 90s, the abortion and reproductive rights attacks, people who bombed abortion clinics or stood outside abortion clinics and screamed at people going in and out of them, or bombed the cars or homes of abortion providers, murdered abortion providers in some cases. Yeah, I mean, that shit happened. That was very much witch trial like. The logic of those people is insane. It makes no sense. But when you understand the fervor of their religious ideology, you see how they got there. And what? How do you negotiate with someone whose worldview is so deeply entrenched that they are willing to murder somebody over it? That's a challenge. And you can't just cherry pick and say, oh, they're psychotics, because they're not. These are like the people that were perpetrating these crimes are like your neighbors, man. Like they were parents, they were, uncles and nieces and, brothers and mothers and fathers and the folks in your community that in your church or, at the local flea market or the farmers market or like the grocery store, like wherever you meet people in your community, that's who they were, not just a band of crazy lunatics. Important to keep in mind. And again, there are certain examples of cult movements that are, overtly like attached to Christianity or like based on, Christian tenets, but very clearly diverge from, what the church would deem acceptable, right? And when I say the church, I understand that there's, a multitude of denominations within Christianity. I get that, but just for the sake of shorthand, again, examples: Jim Jones, he had a Christian message. David Koresh and the Branch Davidians were very much speaking of the Bible, scripture itself. The Children of God, another cult that was based on religious scripture, and then a little more distantly, from the cult mentality and more firmly in the religious zone. I would argue a little bit because of time. And also, the Mormons are really good at keeping their shit tight. Like, they play their cards close to the chest, and they're really good at self policing. So, Mormonism, I think, is a good example of that. And then again, QAnon. Doink. What? Yes, QAnon is quite cuddly with an entirely new generation of evangelical, like, tent revivalist style preachers, evoking hardcore, like, Billy Graham, Jerry Falwell vibes. And it connects with people of a particular faith who feel more and more marginalized from a world that is insisting on, multiculturalism, when everything in their upbringing has told them that that's just going to lead to, chaos and despair. It connects with people who see a world in which their power, or their presumed position in the social hierarchy was a given, and now it seems like it's on less firm footing, and the reaction to that is, going to be a one of a defensive posture, not one of like embracing that, being like, why is this happening, how can I help, right? That's not really the spirit with which most people approach those kind of things, for better or for worse. Again, it roots back to some pretty basic psychological shit. When you feel threatened, some people run, some people fight, it's it's just part of our makeup, and when we are in our feels, especially, it becomes much more difficult to mediate behavior or to check our like epistemological process, like, how did I come to believe this crazy thing? Like, of course you're not performing that critical analysis. That's part of the point. You are encouraged not to. You don't question the faith. That's what faith is. Don't question, right? You can see why it's like so hard to distinguish these different types of entities, because they have such shared mechanisms for supporting their, constituency. Politics, I think by almost by definition meets major criteria of cults. Like, see, again, it's like, this is why it's so hard to define like what is and isn't a cult. It shares all these different means of persuading people. The thing about politics, though, is it's directly connected to governance, and it's like rooted in legal structure, with various ideologies influencing it at various point in times, because we live in a republic, a democracy, a democratic form of government. We do have election officials who are theoretically there to represent the constituency. That constituency is you is or is you ain't my constituency. Politics presents a space in which people manifest their kind of basic needs into policy, but it also is a place where people now can feel and have historically felt compelled to manifest their ideological priorities in policy and law. I argue that that's problematic for lots of reasons that are very now apparent, again, relating to slavery, Jim Crow, etc. Kind of, politicizing or making policy out of beliefs that are formulated through a flawed series of premises. It should be critically reviewed. Like, it just needs to be, and because it does have that direct link to our lives. Political cults are a thing. Religious cults are not the only kind of cult that there is. The Weather Underground was a group of left wing, activists and kind of anarchists in the 60s, kind of counterculture revolutionaries, and they did a lot of bad shit. Like they did a lot like mail bombs and stuff, and they were pretty extreme. ISIS and ISIL, I would I mean they're basically the same organization, the successor to Al Qaeda, or that entire set of political groups manifest very clear cult characteristics. The current day GOP, in many respects, the current day Republican Party does seem to be manifesting some very strong culty vibes with Donald Trump of all people as their dear leader. I don't get it. I'll never get it, and I especially don't get why the religious right connects so strongly with him. Like that makes zero sense to me. But somewhere there's an explanation. QAnon is a big piece of that. It features very prominently insofar as QAnon sets forth a conspiracy theory that credits Trump with like saving the world. That's just like it's just such a funny idea, and considering he's just like the most useless person in the world. Yeah, I just that strains credulity for me, and I really I'm very intrigued by QAnon and all of the folks that are compelled by that, not least because the Q like was outed and vanished, and the last Q drop was like December 2020, and he hasn't said shit since, and yet there is still a lot of action on those Q drops and this continuing like spin-off pocket universes of conspiracy theory that derive from those information pieces, the Q drops themselves, but also then sort of find other adjacencies that are Q drop like. And it's oof, that whole, I mean, for the hardcore, QAnon folks, that whole thing is just, it's mystifying. It's like trying to understand blockchain. Like it's just crazy, like just how much and how deep that shit goes. It's crazy. Um, but when I say crazy, I mean it again, it strains credulity. It's very hard, it's fantastical, it's difficult to believe that it's happening, but it is happening. It is happening right now, and it is manifesting itself into governance. I've mentioned in previous pods that there are candidates running for office who openly subscribe to QAnon theories. And I mean, if nothing else, the fact that that person is owning membership of a cult should give everyone pause in terms of that person's ability to govern and represent their constituency. Their worldview has been manipulated to the point that they no longer have an identity. Their identity is subsumed by the movement. So if you vote a cult member into office, you are voting the cult into office. They're one and the same. Terrifying? Absolutely. But it's no less true. Sorry to break it to you. Social media. Where, oh, where does social media seed itself in our lives? In any event, its influence in all areas of our lives is huge, which is why I talk about it as its own sort of thing. It's a pulpit, it's a stage, an incubator, a courtroom, a library. It's all the things. The internet enables our ability to curate our view of the world carefully. We have most of us, through a network of unconscious bias, tend to make echo chambers for ourselves. We have done so historically, but the ability to shut out the dissenting viewpoints has been much more difficult than it is now, where we can just sort of curate our view of the world through a lens that's agreeable to us. So you mimic that cult isolationism in a self-voluntary way. When it comes to the internet, I feel like, when infinity is placed before you, you'll grab on to the nearest familiar thing to avoid being sucked into the void. Like it's really daunting, again, thinking about the size of the universe. You think about the size of the universe, the fact that it's still expanding, and your mind can absolutely not wrap around the magnitude of that. But in those brief moments where you have like that cosmic brain, and you're able to kind of, remove yourself from your ego and like think about the bigness of the universe, it is a cold and lonely place to be. And nobody loves that. No one wants that. No one feels that. But what that means then is that we, some knowingly, some unknowingly, are able to create these world spaces for ourselves that really are defined by a set of parameters. And we just don't, generally stray outside of that zone. QAnon Trumpism, I think, is a really good example. There's, I've talked a little bit before about Fox News and the fairness in media stuff that happened that created the Fox News sphere and the right-wing media sphere, and that ultimately has allowed that curation to happen across political spectrums, which is different and unique. But that's kind of, it's been pretty well entrenched now. So there's like a whole generation of people whose entire worldview has been defined by this isolated narrative that's distorted. Now, that's not to preclude the idea that for those of you who are like, what about the left wing media? First of all, you just zip it with your whataboutisms, but also saying that the right wing media sphere has problematically isolationist tendencies does not, by itself preclude that left-wing media also practices some form of manipulation or propagandization. So let's just cool it with all that, right? But I think it's been done a lot more effectively on the right side of political ideology, because typically in America, the right side of political ideology since probably the early part of the 20th century has been one of the most efficient and effective political machines to ever exist on planet Earth. These guys know what they're doing. They know how to message. They know how to galvanize their base. They know the exact right triggers. They know how to package it. They know how to message it. They know how to pull everybody together and, have a uniform message. Until fairly recently, that things are getting weird. Again, see the internet, the monkey wrench in the works. But historically, the Republican Party has been incredibly successful at PR, and they're very good at appealing to the fears of their base, in particular white voters and white Christian voters. Likewise, white nationalism is a movement that has found a very comfy home for itself on the internet. And, in the times before the internet, I think we can all agree that white nationalism was still in existence, that it was out there, that it had pockets. We saw it a lot in the 90s, and the FBI, cracked down a lot on like domestic terrorism situations. The Oklahoma bombing situation had, adjacencies to white nationalists. There was a lot of that, kind of movementarianism that was born from, isolationist beliefs and isolationist, media spheres. So it again kind of retains that culty quality of like not allowing you a full picture of the world, and then continuously reinforcing, the beliefs that you had, particularly the angry beliefs that you have, and kind of feeding that monster for you. Similarly, I think what I will call left-wing attack mechanisms, I'm not sure that there's a name for it, because I would ordinarily have used the term cancel culture, but I feel like it's been rendered meaningless right now. So I'll just say left-wing attack mechanisms. And what I mean by this are, on the left of the political spectrum, the left has not been as successful at galvanizing voices. The tent is pretty big, and we have always lent our voice to diversity. And so diversity is fucking messy. And so we're a lot less, and I say we because I do identify as left ideologically speaking, and I'm active politically on the left. So just full disclosure. But I dislike the tendency to, swarm on people who don't demonstrate the same moral certainty about, every transgression that somebody on the opposite end of the political spectrum, may commit. I think that there's scale involved. I also think that you run the risk of like, it's a boy who cried wolf situation. Like there's just like so much noise. You pick on every little thing. And I'm not suggesting that they're little things. P.S. like some of these things are big in and of themselves, but when you put them, when you couch them in a moment compared to, other things of scale that may, kind of have greater priority in terms of the need to galvanize support behind a movement, when you then create just like this whole terrain of like outrage, then your focus completely, breaks. It's, for example, the Occupy Wall Street movement. I don't know if you remember those guys. Like, they had such a great message, man. Like, they were right. Everything that they said was right. Like, that the fact that, the 1% of, the people in our country really have the greatest share of wealth in our country, that's clearly fucked up. But they had no, like, their strategy was like, pitch a tent and just hang. Like, I don't, what, what did that do? Like, what did you accomplish? It was like, I was all for what they, were arguing for. And what they were trying to do as well is to create this truly democratic community where there was no leadership structure. It was purposeful. They did this purposefully so that it couldn't be characterized in this way that, kind of focused attention on a singular ego. And it was really just focusing on the demands and the needs of the group. But they couldn't distill their message into something achievable. It was just like this whole like random mess of like, I'd really like it if they made a cherry flavored toothpaste. Like, it's not anything that, and they would hear all voices, which, again, fair, but they clearly had like an intensity of momentum that they wanted to capitalize on. So they then stole all of the, inertia from that movement by not having some form of leadership, and it died. The whole thing just kind of died out. Lastly, I'll, point to kind of just celebrity culture in general and our like obsessive need to like suck up horrible and, like garish details about, celebrity lives. I think that too kind of shares a lot of like, culty worldview weirdness, right? Because we're sort of, I don't know, maybe not, maybe that's just me. One thing I want to note is I recently watched a video by a guy named Jared Bauer, Baur. That's Jared, Jared. Last name Bauer, Bauer. He created a website that I like a lot called Wisecrack, and they did a lot of like essays about intersections between philosophy and culture, and in particular like pop culture, which I found really cute and fun. And then I think he like sold out his interest, like moved to Finland or something. Anyway, he has a website of his own, or a YouTube channel of his own now, and he talks about an array of different topics. But one of the things he talked about recently was a thing that he coined as tribal indicators. Now, I've kind of addressed loosely that tribal psychology, that need for community and acceptance, is something that, right, it's like a very like root piece of our internal psychological mechanisms, and certainly our epistemological mechanisms. And he kind of calls out, and I just think this is really interesting. I'd encourage you to check it out to see his full argument. But basically what he's saying is like, there's like this increased assignation of cultural phenomena as like a signifier of tribal identity. So like, for example, if you like a given, like if you really like Gina Carano, who was an MMA fighter who then became an actress, and, she was really, really great in the Mandalorian series. And then she said a bunch of dumb shit on Twitter. And then Disney was like, maybe we shouldn't do business anymore. And like, there's a lot of uproar in the community because she was just like speaking her mind, but the stuff that she was saying was like really fucking problematic. So, there's a good example of like, if you like Gina Carano and you're like, stand by Gina Carano, there's a tribal assignation that goes along with that. You're sort of declaring your, loyalty to, a right wing or a more, kind of like socially isolationist, or sort of xenophobic, kind of posture. Or, if you really like, oh God, I'm sure there's so many examples of it on the left, but I can't really like, I'm sure something will come to me. But you get the idea, right? That like, liking something in like the culture becomes attached to an ideology. And I really think he's onto something here. And I don't think it's new. But I think it's rooted in, another kind of cultural moment where people are vulnerable and fearful of change that they don't understand. And there are like plenty of predatory, narcissistic people who are more than willing to weaponize that fear and direct it at both cultural and political frameworks to erode them and create new structures of control that favor, them or, a smaller group. And we're at a moment when culture and politics have collided and have combined into an entirely new and yet kind of old framework for both acquiring control but maintaining power through mechanisms of manipulation through a controlled media narrative, a lot like a cult, but just like on a bigger scale. And I think that, there's lots of like indicators like this, like Jared Bauer's tribal indicators. There's lots of these like flaggy moments where you're like, huh. The most notable, I think, is the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol. I mean, that a more culty moment, I'm not sure I have seen in my lifetime. It was batshit. It was absolutely crazy. I couldn't believe my eyes. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I can't believe it now after all this time. Like, and the fact that like we all watched it happen, and yet there's this whole mechanism in that, culty wing that's like, you didn't see what you thought you saw. Like, that is insulting, first of all. But also, you know, deeply concerning that you would try to dissemble away from the import of that moment into, redirecting all of that anger, all of that culty, belief back into your agenda. Like, it's really gross, FYI. If you're one of those people, I would really encourage you to take a good hard look at that. Boy, what a world. So, deprogramming. Da, da, da. I think that it is. I'm trying to find the right way to articulate this because it sounds so dramatic, right? Like, we've got to deprogram people. Deprogramming, if you don't know, deprogramming is a very controversial process of, kind of extracting somebody from a cult and then, in some cases, kidnapping when those people are not willing to go, when they're still very much like, in the belief system and they have family members that are worried about them. Deprogrammers will sometimes kidnap them and take them somewhere and basically use a lot of the same tactics that the leaders used to bring them back to, the common understood reality. And so you could make the argument that there's ethical problems with that. I would as well, but you can also understand the desperation that would drive families to do that, depending on the situation. So, why then is it necessary to approach political divisions as a discussion of deprogramming? And I feel like, controversial though it may be, and of course I'm not advocating kidnapping. Please don't kidnap anyone. Like, as a general rule, like, just don't kidnap people. It's not a great idea. And I promise you it's hard work. So if you're not into hard work, I guarantee you kidnapping is going to be just a massive project. Don't do it. But, again, controversial though it may be, it does present a kind of roadmap in how to engage someone who's zealously entrenched into a particular mindset, right? If you're thinking about that person as having developed a completely distorted worldview, just telling them it's not real is not going to work. And it's also going to set you up as a threat, to which there will be a lot of defense and anger and fear associated with that. And I mean, that's why arguing on Twitter and Facebook, right, like, really only makes people madder, when you're having political discussions and the political viewpoint of both sides of the argument is a firmly entrenched belief set that feels to that person like generally supported with facts. Just saying, no, you're wrong, is never, ever, ever, ever going to mediate that discussion. There's never going to be a next stage of that discussion. It's an adversarial approach, and it's more likely than not to invoke a defensive response. But, if you're a person who wants to engage with somebody who's in that mindset, then I think a better approach can be looking at it through a deprogramming adjacent lens, which is to, rather than making statements, it's more like asking questions and trying to understand and get them to see the map of their logic. And the longer that person is in an environment where the support is not conditional on, a belief set, where the love and acceptance is more, authentic in that, and acknowledging that person's inner person, their individuality and their personhood. It takes time, and you have to sort of like rebuild a kind of trust, because you are now deconstructing the reality that they've created for themselves. Can be undone. Of course, it can be undone. But just remember that the undoing of that reality leaves them in a really vulnerable state. Where do you go now? And you can't just be like, great, like, we agree that what you believed before was crazy. See you later, alligator. There's got to be a collectively, like as a society, there has to be a sense of empathy. There has to be a sense of trying to engage with a political opponent. And I don't mean that in a running for office sense, right? Like that's how we treat people who are on the other end of the political spectrum. They're enemies, they're opponents. And when you are dealing with a political opponent, whose beliefs, are problematic in the broader sense, right? Like QAnon, or, a really hardcore Trump supporter, I think that it's worthwhile to understand why they came to the support position that they did, and how they formulated the loyalty and the belief. What is resonating with them? What need is being met in that constructed framework that the real world wasn't providing for them? Important questions. So I don't mean to have all the answers. I myself am not a cult leader, but I think that what I can say is that I've viewed great exchanges between people who have conflicting beliefs, and I've viewed nightmare situations. And it feels like the healthy situations were always longer and kinder and more in depth. And I would encourage everybody to just like, stop making assumptions about other people and just start asking some questions. So that's what I have for you this time around. I really appreciate you listening. I hope you enjoyed it. I enjoyed making it. I think this is important. I think a lot of people are suffering right now, are feeling lost, and lost people can get picked up by bad actors pretty easily. So look out for the people in your lives. And if you know anybody who has tendencies, be there for them. That's really the number one thing. Be there for them. Even if you think they're irritating, just let them know that you're there for them. You see them, you hear them. They're not alone. They're accepted and they're loved. And that is a really good way of giving people the tools that they need to heal, rather than going out into the world and looking for, answers from a place of desperation. Just be there. Meanwhile, I'll be here. Thanks so much for listening. And I really appreciate you. If you would like to reach out, if you have any comments or questions or a suggestion for an episode, I hope you'll contact me. I have an email address at Susie Makes a Podcast. That's SUZI Makes a Podcast at gmail.com. And I have an Instagram account at Susie Makes Podcast. So you can find me there. I hope you do. And until next time, bye.